Hello, universe, and welcome to my corner of it. I almost didn't stream today, but I think it's kind of important because there are several things on my mind, and I think it's something that we all have on our mind to a greater or lesser extent today. So today, if you're watching the video, I'm going to be making just some little pen and ink drawing card. I do this from time to time. They're not published. They are simply given away to friends as I feel. And sometimes I just need to draw or doodle. I do a little bit of poetry or phrasing on some of them, and very few, but occasionally some of them have color. So let's clear those away and we'll get started on today. Right, death stories. It feels to me like today is about death, or time to reflect about death a little bit. Coffee is at the ready. Right. So here we go. We're going to take my deaths I'm familiar with or have affected me over the years, because I think all of us have those moments that have impacted us. Right. On my father's side, both of my grandparents died before I was born, well before I was born. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, died when my father was 5. And just move that up a bit. There we go. My paternal grandfather died when my father was in high school. Those two deaths impacted everything that came after. Firstly, because my grandfather remarried a woman who had been widowed. And when he died, my father lost all of his options. You see, my grandfather and his sister, a great aunt, were funeral directors. So death has always been a part of my life. They when my grandfather died, my father would probably have gone into the funeral business anyway, because that was their business. He had a brother who chose not to do that. Excuse me. It's getting to that time of the autumn, I'm afraid. And he went off to learn how to embalm and be a funeral director. He married my mother when he was in his early 20s. She wasn't quite 20 yet. and my new grandmother, who was my real grandmother because she was the only grandmother I ever knew, didn't like my mom very much to begin with. In fact, most of my great aunts thought that my father walked on water and was just the best thing since sliced toast. You see, he had had rheumatic fever as a child and was sent away to a warmer climate. I think they went to Florida. And he lived with some of my great aunts, who were interesting ladies, who are also all past now, obviously. They lived into their 90s, and I think the thing that kept them, let's put it this way, they didn't like my mom either for a while. I don't know if they ever really liked anybody, to be honest, except my dad, because my dad was just wonderful. And my dad had jokingly told them that my mom was older than him. She wasn't, of course, but they thought that Dad had been trapped by my mom, or she wasn't good enough for him. But nobody would have been good enough for him. That's kind of the the irony. Nobody would have been good enough for my dad. Anyway, they believed him, and well, they were. I think the words classic bitches is probably about the right word. I have some fond memories of them, but I also have some not so fond memories of them. Anyway, but death has always been a part of my life. Part of the time I lived in a funeral home when I was growing up. My bedroom was just above the morgue, made for an interesting life. And our living room was just above one of the parlors where the dead were laid out. And but I digress a little bit, because we are talking about deaths and not just the funeral home. When I was expected, or my mom was expecting me, and I was a honeymoon baby. I was literally born 9 months after the honeymoon. My parents were living in a little flat that was part of the funeral home. It wasn't in the main, it was in the funeral home itself, but it was a little flat. And my grandmother and my great aunt were living there as well. And my father was issued an eviction notice by that great aunt because she said she didn't want children in the funeral home. That actually wasn't true. She was feeling as though she was being forced out, which she wasn't. And so we moved. And we moved to a little place in Indiana that was a really nice street. I remember that street a lot. I remember the address. I remember my first school. I had to walk to school every morning. It was about 6 blocks away or thereabouts, I suppose. And we went down the side of, there was a train track. And so we just followed the train track to the tunnel and then went through the tunnel and down the lane to get to the school. And we walked alone from probably the time we were in first grade, because there were so many kids in the neighborhood and we all just walked together. So it was reasonably safe for us to do that, which was kind of nice. I have fond memories of that school. one of the fondest was learning my choral conducting patterns from a TV, a learning music program on television. Anyway. And I had friends across the street. I had friends down the road. I had friends 2 doors down. And one of my special friends was 2 doors down. Her name was Sharon. And Sharon was always kind of a pale girl. She was always sick, as I can remember. And I can't remember what she had. It was probably something like leukemia or something. But she's the first friend who died. And she died when she was 8 or 9. And it was the first time that death had hit me in a way that was tangible. It's one I remember. And I remember her family, and we stayed friends with her family and her other siblings for quite a long time. But eventually moved off that street, and then we moved. My dad got a new job, which was across the street from a Catholic church and a convent school, which we weren't Catholic, but most of my mom's side of the family were. And we happened to go to that church quite a lot for weddings and baptisms, etc., for my mom's side of the family. So we're well acquainted with that. And school was only several blocks away, which was great. So again, we could walk. And one of the best things about that particular house was not the fact that my room was above the morgue, although that has held me in really good stead for every child I've ever taught, that I was able to live with the spooks. But down the block was the library. And I spent a lot of time at the library. I loved reading. I had loved reading before I got there. But having a library down the block was just magic. I went through all of the Nancy Drew books, all of the Hardy Boys books, all of the science fiction I could get my hands on. And I even went into the adult section for science fiction, which has been a lifelong passion for reading. Fantasy and science fiction. Nice. And I would sometimes read 4 or 5 books a week. But there was a library down the road, so that was good. But the house itself was a funeral home, and it had a series of flats or apartments at the back. Ours was, my bedroom was over the morgue, and our living room was directly over, I said, over one of the parlors. And we were there for several years until my dad got a new job, which meant we moved back to Indiana. And my grandparents lived in Illinois, just on the other side of the state line. And I lived with them for a year when my dad got his new job, and I was going into 8th grade, and I was given the choice of whether I wanted to go to school, wanted to finish off my 8th grade year with my friends from grade school, or go to the church school in Indiana, who I also knew all the kids there as well, because they all went to the same church we did, and they were in my Sunday school classes, etc. Yep, and I was in Sunday school. I remember those really well. But I chose to finish off the year at my grade school with my friends, because I knew I would be going to high school with the other group of friends, and that was only a year. And so I had the opportunity to live with my grandparents for a year, and that was great. I think my Uncle Larry was still living at home at that time. I can't remember. So much of that time is just a blur to me. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, I remember some of the I remember I had my aunt's room, and she was great. She's still around and still going strong. In fact, one of her daughters is my birthday twin but I'm older by about 12 years. And that's cool. So then I went back to my parents' house after that year. But then, and then I went to the high school. I should go back because there is a death I forgot to mention. I was in 5th grade. We were all living in the funeral home at the time. And my mom became pregnant. It was a surprise, I think. I don't think it was planned. And it was also the year that JFK died. And I remember coming home for lunch that day and becoming aware of the assassination. But I have it in my mind that those were the same day, that Mom lost the baby and JFK died on the same day. It was a very sad time. It was a very, very sad time for the family. And funnily enough, I had, when I did get to high school, I had a very good friend, who's still a friend, who had my friend is my age. Her brother was my brother's age, and her second brother would have been the same age as the baby my mom lost. They were a special family, and remember a lot of good times with them. So the loss of that baby hit me really hard. I think I probably wanted it. I don't know if my mom and dad really, really wanted to have a baby at that point. I think they were nervous about a lot of things. I don't think they didn't want. It was just that it was a surprise. And as happens in life, is that you want to do other things with your life, and then something happens that makes that impossible. And then the guilt of wanting something to, not wanting the baby to die, or the fetus to whatever, to lose the baby. But then you have that kind of guilt thing going on, even when there's no guilt involved. It's just an act of nature. My high school years were filled with death, but they were the public sorts of death. Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, among two. And the way that awakened a sense of social consciousness that I hadn't had before. I remember those days really well. I remember the potential acts of violence and the acts of violence that occurred in and around my school and my city and around the country, and how devastating it was for everyone, and changing the way perspective of how you see the world. When I was just about ready to graduate high school, graduate university, there is one death during my university years I don't talk about very much, but I'll just say that it profoundly influenced everything that I chose to do after. I don't have permission to talk about that one, but I'll say that much. But the year that I graduated university and I was off on my first teaching job was the summer before. I'd just gotten my first teaching job, and my grandmother died. She hadn't been particularly well. She hadn't been particularly unwell. She hadn't been in hospital or anything, but I think twos maybe. But she died. And the first person that was called was my dad. My dad couldn't embalm her. She was too close a member of family for that. But I remember us all going over to the house to help my grandfather and to sort out some things. And because my grandmother kept all the books and all of the accounts for the family, there was this mad search through the house for all of the paperwork, because it wasn't all in one place and it wasn't collated in a way that was easily accessible. And we spent several hours going through everything. My grandparents grew up during the Depression, and although my grandfather's family came over to this country, and I gather when he came over from Europe with his family, he was baby and was brought over. He was in the proverbial shoebox. He was about that size. But my grandmother's family were reasonably well off. As I understand it, they had a shop. And during the Depression, they gave a lot of people credit, and a lot of that credit was never paid back. So they lost the shop. I think my grandmother, the story goes, my grandmother had fur coats when she was a kid. Yikes. They must have been really wealthy. My dad's family were reasonably wealthy, and pillars of the community because of the funeral home. But all that changed when the Depression hit for my grandparents and when my father was evicted from the funeral home. So I never suffered for anything. There was never a time that we were hungry or went without in any meaningful way. So I don't want it to mean that. But it was a life-changing moment for both of them, really. So they searched the house, my grandmother's house, and in between the sheets and in between the towels and underneath cushions and underneath mattresses and you name it, there was money. And there was quite a lot of money. They had bank account and they had savings and they had all of that. But they always kept something at home just in case. I love my grandparents very much. My grandfather passed away a few years later after I'd already moved to London. And I remember I came home, I think I was married. Chris was going to join me eventually. But I remember just being one of two flights I took with the death notice thing. My grandfather was dying. And he was dead before I came home. So I was coming home for the funeral. And I ended up staying for 6 weeks that summer, because there was no point in coming home and not visiting for a while. It was very expensive to fly. It still is. And the second one was a few years later. And for a short period of time, I sang professionally. And I was on a major tour with a Judith Ware opera and a dance company. And I received notice that my father had had a massive heart attack. And I flew home. They left the machines on long enough for me to be there. I'm grateful for that. It was awful. We were lucky that he was in a state where we could turn off the machines. Had he been in another state, we would have had to keep him on ventilator almost, well, could have been forever. And with all that's going on in America at the moment with abortion, the rights to a woman's choice, and it's not even a choice, it's a woman's decision, it's her body, and people trying to take those choices away from women, health choices, no exceptions for rape, no exceptions for incest, no exceptions for ectopic pregnancy. I wonder how long it will be before all states have to keep people on ventilators when they are brain dead. Is that the next step? Because I would have thought that would be one of their next things to do, because of course we all must respect life until we don't. So even if that fetus is non-viable, you're going to keep that baby in you, and we're just going to send you home, because we might have to go to prison because we helped you. And the whole thing about people theoretically having a chosen abortion by the time they're 9 months pregnant. Nobody carries a baby that long and then just decides to get rid of it because they don't want it. If it's something that late term, it means that there's something seriously wrong with the pregnancy. And it's hard decisions people have to make, and decisions they have to live with. But it should be their decisions, not someone else's. And I am so angry about that. So angry that there are people in the United States who think that's right. To take away a woman's health care choices, the hardest decisions anyone would have to make. And to seem to think that people just do it on a whim. I don't think so. It's all just so sad. And not easy for anyone. I started teaching after university at a small school, an hour the other side of Rockford. And although death was something I was used to because I walked through the funeral home, I saw bodies all the time as a kid and never really thought too much of it unless I knew who it was. And I think that's the thing, is that if you know the person, it's more, well, of course it's more personal that you know them. I think I'm making a hash of this, but it's not a thought process. It's just I just draw and just keep going until I'm done. But there was a fire one night in a small community that I was teaching in, and both the parents and two of the, I think, 4 kids died in the fire. I had never come across death on that scale in my life before. I had never attended a funeral with more than 1 casket, and here was a funeral with 4. I'm not desensitized to it, obviously, and 2 of those people were my students. And the surviving children were also my students. You don't get prepared at university for the death of your students. And particularly if you're a young teacher and an inexperienced teacher, it's finding ways of dealing with those feelings. All of us are going to have them. All of us who teach are going to have a child or a child's parent who dies. I had a lovely little girl in one of the schools I was doing a festival with, and we were doing a song called, anyway, it was a song about remembering children who don't get to live enough of their lives cut short. It was a Holocaust-inspired song, but it had a lot of depth of meaning for many things. And I remember there was one little girl who had recently lost her father, and I wasn't changing the programming. The program was already done, but we had a chat, and she said, I would rather not sing this one. I said, that's fine, not to worry. If you feel like you want to sing, fine. If you don't feel like you want to sing it, that's also fine. And she didn't in rehearsal, but she did in the concert. We all have to find our own way through. One of the hardest deaths to talk about, and I think I've already done this on this channel, but I'll just say it again, was the day that I was teaching a group of kindergartners, and someone from the office came in to bring me a note, which I stupidly read as I was sitting there. It's very unusual to be brought a note from the office in the middle of a class. And it's usually something that you probably need to deal with fairly quickish. But I shouldn't have read it until after the end of the class. But I was stupid. And that was the death of an entire family that I'd taught the previous couple of years. The father killed everyone, the dog, I don't know if there were 2 dogs or one, I can't remember, and then killed himself. No one prepares you for those things. shot them. And then finally, there's my husband, who died 2019, just as the autumn was starting. We'd been together, married for 40 years plus, been together for a very long time. And we home hospiced him because that was possible. God bless the national health, that's for sure. And those sorts of deaths, the death where you make the deathbed, you put the sheets on the last bed that your partner will sleep in. You provide them with the last drink they will ever have. You give them the last hug or kiss they will ever have. You know that your life is going to be very different when they're gone. So, today of all days, whether you're a royalist or not, and to be honest, I'm not really much care if there is a queen or there is a king, or it doesn't impact my life in a way, in that way. I respect my friends and acquaintances and colleagues who are all devastated by the news of Queen Elizabeth's death. But I think on a day like today, all of us reflect on the deaths that have impacted our lives. And I burn candles most days. And as I put my candles on, I just remember people. And that's it. Enjoy remembering.